Hello, everyone. This is recording number 6 for Aristotle, a class on the Nicomachean Ethics. Today's topic is how the virtues of character relate to human nature. And that is one of the most debated issues in Aristotelian ethics. So, even though there would be a lot to address kind of across many Aristotelian writings and also writings in the Neo-Aristotelian tradition, I'm going to start us off by just looking quite specifically at chapter 1 and chapter 4 in book 2. At the beginning of chapter 1, Aristotle says that he is rejecting two views and accepting a third one. The two views that he rejects are that virtue is contrary to nature and that it is by nature. Instead, he is going to accept that we are naturally able to receive the virtues, namely by habituation. His first step then is to make a quasi-etymological observation, namely that the Greek words for habit, habituation, and character are quite close. And he takes that as sufficient reason to say that, in some sense, the very word character virtues tells us that they are acquired by habituation. And in some kind of preliminary way, we can say, well, what that means is that they are acquired by repeated action, namely in the sense in which a virtuous person would act. But so far, we don't have like a theory of habituation or anything like that. We just have that kind of premise. But that premise is going to be used in assessing the other two options about the relation between virtue and nature that Aristotle does not accept. And by assessing these options, Aristotle is also developing his theory of habituation. So the first option that he rejects is that virtue is contrary to nature. Aristotle is proposing that if it were contrary to nature, then it would simply not be possible to become virtuous through habituation. His illustration is if you were to throw a stone upwards many, many times over, the stone would nevertheless not become a thing that moves upwards, because that is simply contrary to its nature. And that is how it would be if the virtues were contrary to our nature. We could perform actions that, as it were, fall under the description of virtuous actions as many times as we wanted, and yet we would not thereby become habituated towards virtue. So the other option that Aristotle rejects is that virtue is by nature. Now, what would that mean? Aristotle illustrates what that would mean by saying that the senses are by nature. And when something is by nature, then the thing that is by nature comes first, and the activities that belong to it come second. So, for example, we have vision, and we have that capacity. And based on that, we engage in acts of seeing. So you have the capacity first, and then you have the activity. But in the case of virtue, it's the other way around. Namely, you need to first perform virtuous actions and then thereby become virtuous. So that is a rejection of the option that virtue is by nature, but it also leaves Aristotle, as it were, with a puzzle. And that puzzle is then addressed quite specifically in chapter 4 of book 2. The puzzle is that it could seem somehow nonsensical almost that we are saying that one becomes virtuous by performing virtuous actions. Could our opponent maybe say, how am I going to perform virtuous actions if I'm not already virtuous? How is that supposed to work? And chapter 4 offers an answer to that puzzle. And I'm only mentioning one bit of that answer here, namely that we can perform virtuous, or in chapter 4, the example is just actions without being already just, having the virtue of justice, by chance or by guidance. Now, for example, a child might be told by her parents, do this, do this, do that. And so over time, the parents would tell her many, many times to share in certain ways, to treat other people in certain ways, and so on and so forth. So the child would become habituated towards justice by performing just actions. And she can do that by being instructed accordingly without herself already having the virtue of justice. So that is Aristotle's answer, or part of Aristotle's answer to this puzzle. Now, setting the other details of chapter 4 aside for now, I want to end this recording by just flagging a kind of big picture question. Over the centuries, Aristotelians have debated whether Aristotle is maybe somewhat closer to the view that virtue is by nature than to the view that it is contrary to nature. For example, Aquinas, who counts as an Aristotelian, defends the view that we have natural inclinations towards the good. And that could sound like a view that is at least somehow in the neighborhood of the view that we are virtuous by nature. It is not quite the same, but it seems somewhat closer to that than to the view that virtue is contrary to nature. And I want to invite you to think about that, also in light of the ideas that we discussed at the beginning of the semester, which come up right at the beginning of Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics about human agency and the view that human beings desire the good or are motivated in their actions by ultimately aiming at the good. So the question I want to leave you with is whether those ideas about agency somehow pushed Aristotle at least closer to a position according to which nature is inclined towards virtue, as opposed to a position according to which our nature is contrary to virtue.